Our country is in a defining moment. We face an election that could shake the very foundation of our democracy. Hundreds of thousands are in the streets demanding an end to systemic racism and the state-sponsored murder of Black people, while others, cheered on by our commander-in-chief, respond with hate and violence. It is both exhilarating and terrifying. To put things in perspective, we are honored to welcome three remarkable men who have dedicated their lives to social justice. Reverend Al Sharpton is the host of MSNBC's Politics Nation and the founder and president of the National Action Network, one of the leading civil rights organizations in the world. With over 40 years of experience as a community leader, politician, minister, and advocate, the Reverend Al Sharpton is one of America's most renowned civil rights leaders. Sharpton also hosts the nationally syndicated radio show Keeping It Real, which broadcasts in 40 markets 5 days a week. I think it's a miracle that he's even here right now. He lives in New York. Martin Luther King III is the second child of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, and has motivated audiences around the world with his insightful messages of hope and civility. He has taken up the torch of his parents and continued the quest for equality and justice for all people. He has traveled extensively around the globe, spreading the message of nonviolence and its role in resolving global, international, and cross-cultural conflicts. In addition to public service as an elected commissioner of Fulton County, Georgia, Mr. King has served as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also co-founded by his father, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, founded by his mother after the assassination of his father. He has himself co-founded several organizations, including Realizing the Dream, a nonprofit governmental organization that fosters nonviolent peace and development strategies. Pete Buttigieg served 2 terms as mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and was a Democratic candidate for president of the United States this year. A graduate of Harvard University and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, Buttigieg served for 7 years as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, taking a leave of absence from the mayor's office for deployment to Afghanistan in 2014. In April 2019, he announced his candidacy for president, and in February 2020, won the Iowa caucuses, becoming the first openly gay person to ever win a presidential primary or a caucus. He is the author of Shortest Way Home, which came out last year. His new book, Trust, America's Best Chance, comes out October 6th. We'll be part of a huge multi-state, multi-bookstore event with Mayor Buttigieg on October 4th. So please check out our events calendar on our website or on Facebook. Before we bring our esteemed guests on, please remember to type any questions you have in the comment thread. Left Bank Books event coordinator Shane Mullen will be moderating Q&A at the end of the presentation. And now, please welcome Pete Buttigieg, Martin Luther King III, and Reverend Al Sharpton to the screen.
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
Let me start by saying the motive that I had for writing this book was I felt that we were at a critical juncture in American history. As we look at what is going on throughout the last several months, in the middle of the pandemic, we saw the brutal killing of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis. We saw what was, to me, a murder of Breonna Taylor in the city of Louisville, Kentucky. We saw Rashad Brooks being killed running from police at a Wendy's in Atlanta, Georgia. And we saw Ahmaud Arbery killed by 3 men that were not law enforcement in Brunswick, Georgia, all in the space of 1 month. And it began to energize a movement around policing. I would think that because of the pandemic and everyone was locked down and was watching the news, because there was no sports, there was no basketball, there was no baseball, you were glued to the news, hoping there would be good news that we could get out of our lockdowns. And when we saw that video over and over again, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, I think it hit a lot of Americans of all races that this must stop. And as Martin, you and I said at the first of the funerals, and went on from there to many times of the marches and demonstrations, culminating with the huge march of the 20th anniversary of the 63 when your father delivered the I Have a Dream speech, which is now historic, where we had all those families and more there, and tens of thousands of people. We are at a point where this country has to deal with racism, sexism, homophobia, and war. Nothing could symbolize it more than the last two presidents. The president that now sits in office that I think represents the road toward racism, sexism, homophobia, and militarism, and the last president that represented another direction that had been building up for the last half century from the work of Dr. King, your father, and the work of others. But I wanted in this book to say that all Americans must stand up, and we must do it in an intersectional way. As you read this book, I not only talk about what has happened in the Black community, but what has happened in the community of the LGBTQ constituents, and what has happened to women, and what has happened to those that are of other disadvantages. I'm convinced that unless we can build an intersectional movement and an intersectional understanding that we all must fight together, even though we have distinct pain, distinct abuses, we're going to have to fight together, because the enemies of any of us is usually the enemies of all of us. Nothing could be clearer than we are on about 30 some odd days from this presidential election, where we have a president that clearly has said that he will flame the fires, he will fan the flames, I should put it that way, of racism, of sexism, of militarism, and homophobia, and do it openly and proudly. And he will bring America that way. At the crossroads, our challenge, and that is what I write throughout my book, our challenge is to keep it geared toward the way it was going before this started 3.5 years ago, which is why I wanted this book to come out before the election, to challenge people to become active in their own way. Everyone can't lead marches and protest and do media like I do. Everyone doesn't have a global audience and respect and demand like you do, Martin. Everyone can't generate the kind of political excitement and really break down barriers like you did, Mayor Pete. But everyone could do something if it's in their home, if it's in their pool hall or church or barbershop or beauty parlor. Everyone can touch someone to stand up and begin this dialogue and find that we may have to come together, either forward and embrace or back into each other. But either way, we're going to have to fight this together. I remember, and I talk about in the book, when you, Mayor Pete, announced you was running for president, and I knew there were strains of homophobia still in the Black community. I invited you to go to a famous soul food restaurant with me in Harlem, right in the middle of Harlem, to say a statement that, yes, you're white, yes, you're a veteran, yes, you're gay, and yes, we've got to stand together. And you took me up on it and came. And you were mobbed there, to even my surprise, because people have grown way more than some of those that claim to have leadership in this country, like the president of the United States. I remember 25 years ago or so, Martin, you and I started a relationship that we would march together. We even were arrested together, leading marches in St. Louis. And you got your mother to sit and spend time with me who would, in her own gentle way, correct me in terms of some of the things I would say that gave a misinterpretation of what we meant, and taught us that the King tradition was that you can't become like those you fight. And I've seen, even after her going on and transcending to the other side, that you've had to hold that banner, even when others wanted to give way to anger and rage. And you've been that symbol, and you've stood there and tried to deal with a collectivism that, even though you're 2 or 3 years younger than me, you've been instructive to even me that we're stronger together and that we must rise together. If we don't turn this country around, I think we will lead to destruction of all of our silos and all of our tribes and all of our communities, because this country is on a collision course. Just look at the nomination on Saturday of the president of a new Supreme Court justice who has a record of standing against the Affordable Care Act and standing against affirmative action and standing against women's right to choose and standing against things that all of us believe in. And she is on the fast track to be given a hearing and possibly and be elected by the Senate to the court. The same Senate that couldn't come together to get a stimulus bill because Americans have run out of the stimulus money that was given them in terms of a pandemic that none of them caused. They couldn't get together to help Americans. They couldn't get together to help small businesses, but they've gotten together to put a right winger on the court that will tilt the court another way. She was the clerk for Justice Scalia. I will never forget, in 2013, you and I, Martin, sat in the courtroom at the Supreme Court in the hearing where Justice Scalia, in discussing an oral arguments about the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis was sitting across the aisle from us. He said, it sounds like a racial entitlement to me. His protege is about to be put on the court. Affirmative action and voting rights and women's right to choose and first the Affordable Care Act are all scheduled for this session of the Supreme Court. Not to mention, if this election goes to the Supreme Court, like Gore versus Bush, she will have one of the deciding votes. So even if we get a moderate, one of the conservatives, as in the case of Judge Roberts, that did go and save the Affordable Care Act last time, it won't matter because there are 3 votes up. If you get 1, there are still 2 that can tip it and end all of that. If they end the Affordable Care Act, 30 million Americans will automatically lose their insurance. 100 million Americans will not be able to deal with pre-existing conditions. These are immediate threats that we must rise up and deal with. So I hope as we talk this brief time tonight and as people read my book, they will understand that none of us have all the answers, but all of us have the problem. And if we don't rise up together, I don't think we will be able to give our children a better life than ours. Every generation that preceded us was able to struggle somehow and find a way to give their children better than they did receive. We may be the first generation that hands our children a nation that's going backwards if we don't rise up. I want you to respond, Martin, to what I've said and give a sense of how you see where we are, and then you, Mayor Pete.
Okay. First of all, Rev, let me just basically congratulate you on the release of this awesome material. And beyond it being timely, it certainly is timely, but it is really an instruction manual to some degree that presents a perspective for us to be able to be victorious, because we know that the modern civil rights movement built coalitions, and this has got to be a coalition effort. It can't be one group or organization. It has to be a number of us. It has to be women and men and families and children of goodwill, not that others, I don't want to judge what others' will or intent is, but I do know for us to move forward, we've got to come together collectively and raise our voices as a choir. Any one of us can talk and maybe be heard or not be heard. But when we sing together as in a musical way, we seem to have made strides over the past. My responding to what you've just laid out, so much that is going on in our nation, and as you've laid out in this manuscript, you've written several manuscripts, but I think, Rev, this is one of your best. It is one that everyone, even if you're on an opposite side, you still can garner something from this manuscript. And so, I think that what we saw, particularly right after the tragedy of George Floyd, materialized because partially the pandemic created a scenario where all of us were at home. So for the first time, I mean, we in the African-American community, communities of colors, in the LGBT community have been going through oppression for years. But the fact of the matter is all of us were able to see this all over the world. And you had the largest demonstrations on the planet for civil and human rights during that period. Millions of people, not just here in the United States, but obviously in Australia, in Europe, on the African continent, in South America, just about every continent, there were demonstrations. And I think that energy has to be galvanized directly coming back to the United States and manifested in a way so that not only do we understand the importance of voting, it really is about protecting, preserving, and sustaining democracy. I mean, we really have no choice. We thought, many of us may have thought that in 2008, when President Obama was elected, that was the most important election of our lifetime. It was certainly a significant election, but I really do believe this is the most important election of our lifetimes in terms of the direction that our nation is going to take, whether it is domestic issues, as you've stated, the Affordable Care Act, whether it is climate change. I mean, we have a chief administrator who doesn't believe in climate change. I mean, I don't know what it takes for people to wake up because this is the moment that we should all be woke, as young folks say. It's the moment we must all be woke and participate. Dad used to say, as you know, Rev, and as you probably know, Mayor Pete, a voteless people is a powerless people. And the most important step that we can take is that short step to the ballot box. That has never been more true than at this particular election, at this juncture, when every day there are barriers that are being used to break down, just to suppress. I mean, we live in a nation that out of 170 democracies, we as the United States vote at 139, 138 countries voted higher levels than us. That should be unacceptable. Our voting is a minimum. We need to be engaged, not just in voting. We need to engage about social justice as much of the nation is now, but we need to always be engaged. I think from time to time we've elected people. For example, when President Obama was elected, he challenged us to stay engaged on the battlefield. And many of us went home and sat down. But those on the opposite side, they continue to organize. And so 8 years later, they were able to forge their agenda, even though they do not represent the majority of points of view, I think, in this country. I think the majority has to be engaged this time like never before. And I think that's part of, again, what your book constantly is telling us. The majority has to awaken and take its role. Now is the time. There is no greater opportunity. Participate and cast your votes.
Thank you, Martin. Mayor Pete, how do you see things?
First of all, Reverend, I want to say what an honor it is to be with you and to be with Martin Luther King III. And I want to take a moment to honor the memory of your mother, who you shared. It's her birthday today, and I know that she'd be very proud, Reverend, of the of your life's work, as well as the book that you've written, which is so timely for the reasons that we've been discussing. Every time it feels like the stakes of this moment couldn't go higher, they go higher. And we were already at the beginning of this year, back when I was running for president, talking about how this was the most important election of our lifetimes. And it was, only to then see society brought to a standstill by the arrival of this pandemic and the mishandling of it that has cost so many lives. And as you write about in the book, the pandemic really exploited the racial and social inequities in our country and also made them deeper. And we saw that as workers who have been treated as disposable were suddenly told that they were essential. And while they are still not paid as essential, they are required to go to work as though indispensable. We've seen it then in what arrived soon after the pandemic, which is this moment of racial reckoning that our country has faced after the killing, the murder of George Floyd and so many of those you mentioned and so many more, whether it's Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor or so many who don't get the headlines. And I think what has made this time different, perhaps, is a greater awareness among well-intentioned white Americans that there is going to be more to confronting institutional racism and systemic racism than merely defeating the likes of the KKK. That's there. And those extreme voices have been able to rear their ugly head in a whole new way because this president has enabled and cultivated that. But the truth is, a big part of what this country must overcome is a different and a more subtle complicity in this kind of structure of privilege and oppression that many people who get up in the morning believing themselves to detest racism have not yet come to terms with the ways in which they've benefited, I should say, in which we've benefited from it. And that awakening is what gives me great hope that there is an intersectional quality to that awakening that is just the kind of movement that you're calling for in your book. And at the same time, I think we're right to be extremely gravely concerned about whether our country will, in fact, at this moment, turn the corner, whether it is on racial injustice or economic inequality, or even dealing with the threats from pandemic preparedness to climate change that are upon us. Because our moment of maximum power as citizens, the moment of election, is also one where we see the mechanics of the elections facing an extraordinary level of obstruction, of suppression, of really often naked efforts to make it harder for people to vote, in addition to efforts to deter people from voting who are eligible and who have so much on the line. That's why I think history will record one of two things about the end of the year 2020, that it either was the beginning of a different kind of awareness and direction in this country, or that it was the beginning of a decline that saw America lose what was most promising about America. And I'm curious as we speak, Reverend, having seen the way you chose to structure your book. I don't want to assume anything or ascribe anything to you, but I'm curious if you wrote it the way I received it, which is I noticed that the way you structure it, and part of what makes it such an interesting read, is that you talk about history and you talk about these big concerns and issues. And then you talk about memoir, you talk about your own experiences, but you also made a decision to fill the book with portraits, almost mini biographies of figures from Bayard Rustin to Al Gore, individuals who in various ways have made a difference. You talk about Greta Thunberg, all kinds of figures from history and from our time. And at least the way I received that, was a reminder that it falls to individual people, famous or ordinary, to actually make good on any of these big ideas we're talking about. And I wonder, as you were weaving this, why you made that choice to have those portraits woven in with those calls to action that you put in the book.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to do that is because all of them started as ordinary people, whether it was those that I profiled in the section that I talked about racism, or that I talked about homophobia or the LGBTQ community, or those in climate change like Greta, or those that were dealing with the question of anti-Semitism. Nobody started that I wrote about as famous or they had entitlement. They all started as ordinary people that had an extraordinary contribution, some of whom did not live to even be heralded or saluted for it. And I wanted to give the overview of how I felt about an issue, where I felt we should go, and then profile some of the people that took that path and what happened to them. Martin, you know the story as well as anyone of Bod Rustin. Bod Rustin, who was Black and gay in the 50s, came to Montgomery to help your father with the Montgomery bus boycott. And for many years, even though he was a major strategist and was one of the key organizers of the 63 March on Washington, he had to take a background position because he was gay and there was outright homophobia in the Black church. I think the first person that I ever heard publicly talk about dealing with homophobia in the Black community was your mother. Very few people understand that Coretta Scott King was really an advocate of everybody dealing with this kind of intersectionalism way before it became popular, way before I knew what intersectionalism was. And I wanted to talk about that in the book because I know that there are people that will buy the book, people that are in public that go through those exchanges and struggles and need to know that somebody like Rustin and Mrs. King had to address that. Because there are people that right now have to deal with that in their homes, in their churches, and they need to know that's not uncommon. It's been done by people before you, and it takes that kind of courage to do that. And I think you know, Martin, how we've had to deal with that throughout the struggle, even to this day.
Yeah, absolutely, Rev. And in fact, you know, I think that clearly our nation is a work in progress, but we have made gains and must make even further gains. You know, over a period of time, it seems like, you know, I mean, Dad used to talk about in an analogy of how people had gone to sleep. We use the term, now we hear young people talking about stay awake, stay woke. And, you know, he used the analogy in one of the sermons, and I know you have as well, Rev, and Mayor Pete, I know you've heard about how, you know, it's almost like the story of Rip Van Winkle, where one went to sleep and you know, King James was in charge, and when they woke up, you know, George Washington was the president. People had slept for many years. Well, today, the blinders are off. We know where we are. The question is, are we going to have the, not just courage, but the fortitude? You know, whatever we're going through at this particular moment, I'm sure we will get past. But the question is, do we get past it right now? And we get past it right now by being engaged like never before. And I just believe, you know, as a person of faith, I have to believe that good prevails over evil. You know, Dad talked about the moral arc of the universe being long and bending toward justice. But the way to help that occur is to participate by casting your votes in this election cycle. And, you know, Rev, your life has been demonstrated. I know that over the years, when I think about the sacrifices that you personally have made for particularly victims who lost their loved ones, and had your voice not been there, many of these cases that are being addressed at this moment would never have gotten any level of justice. And while justice doesn't seem to have come yet, we know that in time, justice is going to come. Some may say, well, justice delayed is not justice at all. But whenever the justice occurs, I mean, I was 10 years old, as you know, when Dad was killed. I was 16 when my grandmother, many people don't know, was gunned down in the church while playing the Lord's Prayer. And, you know, maybe even to this day, people do not know really what happened with Martin Luther King Jr. They know he was murdered, and they think James Earl Ray did it. But that, you know, I'm not concerned about that. I'm not saying that I personally think about this every day. But whenever we find out what the truth is, every victim not only deserves to know the truth, but deserves to have some opportunity to close what has happened tragically to them. And so, Rev, what I'm saying here is you have given those many families those opportunities. And they're huge sacrifices that you have made. And so I just want you to know how much I personally appreciate you. And I hope that the nation does. I know the families do, but I hope the nation understands that, because oftentimes, Mr. Mayor, as you know, as a politician, you've been criticized. And I applauded your stand when your city had a very difficult issue. And you stood and addressed that issue in a forthright way, saying, no, we're not where we need to be, but we're going to keep working on these issues. That's the kind of courage that it takes to deal with these issues that we're all dealing with now in our society. And I'm a very positive person. So even that, there are days when I have to withdraw. And I think we all from time to time have to take a step back to refortify ourselves. And again, as you talk about in the book, collectively coming to the table to move forward. This is about moving the nation forward in a positive way, not a negative way, a positive way. And that is so profound. That is so appropriate. That is so needed. That is so now.
Let me ask that. Let me touch on what you said, Martin, because Mayor Pete, one of the things that we advocated at the march that Martin and I co-convened, the Commitment March, August 28th, was to push the George Floyd Policing and Justice Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. As one who's been a mayor, who's had to deal with policing and had to deal with controversies, how important is it at this period that we have legislation that changes where we are? So it is not just about how we can keep rallying people, but really have laws that will be there long after the rallying and the marching that changes the culture. The example I'm thinking of is, had we not had Dr. King and Hosea Williams and John Lewis doing the Voting Rights Act, we may not have had the amount of elected officials of color that we have now. Right there in the St. Louis area, we saw a wealthy man and woman stand outside on the front of their mansion with guns as a nonviolent march of Black Lives Matter. People marched past their house, headed somewhere. They weren't even marching on them. And it was a Black woman prosecutor that could enforce the law that has brought them up on charges. Well, that's a direct result of the generation ahead of us opening up voting so that we can do that. How important is it that we deal with legislation as we deal with this moment of reflection around the question of race and police in this country?
Well, it's critically important. This has been a source of anguish in our community, as in so many others. And the reality is that all of the actions that are so important as people take to the streets to challenge the status quo, to challenge police departments, to challenge administrations, as mine was challenged by people who stepped forward saying things must change, and they needed to change. But this only truly bears fruit if it leads to changes in policy. And many of those changes in policy have to happen at the federal level. Yes, we need practices all the way down to the level of the decisions that an officer makes and the accountability that an individual officer can expect when they go out to work. And at the same time, all of this takes place in a framework of national law that, frankly, sometimes makes it actively harder in order to get justice in these cases, or in order to marshal the resources that are going to be needed, not only for policing to be done in a racially just fashion, but for communities to develop with the kind of economic empowerment, for example, that would make it less likely that we would see as many young Black men as we do in the scenarios where they wind up experiencing sometimes fatal police violence. All of these things are connected together. And the levers of power are where these decisions really get made. And so I applaud the effort to make sure not only that the marches continue, that the advocacy continues, whether it's online or whether it's on the streets, but that actually leads to changes in law and changes in administration. You know, we felt the difference right away between an administration before Donald Trump where we could call the Department of Justice and say, hey, we've got a concern here and we need resources and tools to improve things. And this one, which invited those individuals you were mentioning in St. Louis who were waving loaded weapons at peaceful protesters, invited them to speak at the Republican National Convention as though they ought to be commended, as though he was proud to have their support. It shows you how out of whack things have become. And it's why all of this has to lead to concrete action and not only expression. And the expression is so important, but it has to be connected up to a plan. And I think that's part of the value of your book, ending in a very practical note with the steps that you think are needed in order to make real change.
Martin, let me ask you this, and I know we're going to take questions in a minute, but you travel probably internationally more than most people, and certainly more than most people that I know. How does the world look at this almost 180-degree turn between the last president and this president? And how do we look to the world that watched George Floyd, watched Breonna Taylor? What is the global picture, and how does that affect our standing even in other areas like trade and other areas of negotiation, when the whole perception of what America stands for has changed in terms of how outsiders would view us?
Wow, Rev, that's a very interesting question because, quite frankly, most people want to know what has happened to America. How did you elect a person who personifies so much difference? And how do you even have the gall to go around the world talking about democracy when your head of state does not personify democracy? It comes out and attacks everyone, every other head of state, other than those who seem to be dictatorial. He embraces a lot of dictators. But I think that people want to understand what has happened in America. And quite frankly, I didn't have an explanation. I was like, many of us must have gone to sleep and did not participate. That's the only thing you can do. Now, the irony of all of that is that the tragedy of George Floyd mobilized the world around the issue of racial injustice and policing, because we saw demonstrations in Australia and on the African continent, in Europe, in South America. So every continent we saw a demonstration. And so what that gives us an opportunity to do is to once and for all address the issue of racial intolerance, racial insensitivity, and it takes it to a new trajectory, because it's not just an issue that impacts Blacks in the United States. It impacts people of color all over the world. And so a mobilization effort will ultimately help us to say, now that we've identified a real problem, the only way you can ever address something is you have to acknowledge that it exists. And in some ways, well, I don't know if I want to say it that way, but I'll say we've acknowledged it, so we will get it addressed. Dad, as you know, Rev, talked about the eradication of the triple evils of poverty, racism. He said militarism. I've sort of changed militarism to violence. It's still true. We've got to rid our society of racism, poverty, and violence. And we, again, your book is so prophetic because it tells us, in a sense, how, when we come together, we can, in fact, what I would say is ultimately, at some point, realize the dream. We can address these ills that exist within our society. We are a much better nation than some of the behavior that we've seen, even from those who are adversaries. I'll say adversaries as opposed to enemies. Just, it's the same, it means enemy, obviously, but maybe it's a more general word. They're adversaries. They have a different position. I don't always understand that position. They may not understand my position, but we got to find a way for Americans overall to be victorious. And you can't do it by going extreme one way or totally extreme the other. We have to create a more balanced and harmonious nation, but we have to always be moving forward. And I think at this point, we potentially are moving backward.
No, I think that's right. And Mayor Pete, when I remember during the whole question of the so-called border wall was being raised, and I was in England, and a clergyman asked me, "How can you all stand still while children are being put in cages, and you call yourselves a nation that represents the bastion of some kind of democratic morality?" And you can't even answer that. I mean, it looks so horrific to us here, but looking at it through the lens of people in the other parts of the world who they themselves don't claim to be all of that, and have societies that have very, very serious humanitarian issues. But to look at us, and we've had such disasters and tragedies this summer. We forget we still have children in cages just for coming across the Mexican border. It's been so much abuse that we almost can't keep up with it. And some people just tune out or go to sleep, as Martin says, rather than deal with the fact we are in a civilizational crisis in this country.
That's right. That's right. And it is a moral crisis that I think reverberates globally, because if the U.S. cannot authentically stand up for these things, if we can't represent human rights because here at home children are being put in cages, if we can't represent democracy because here at home there's racial voter suppression or other abuses of the democratic system to a degree that we can't quite lay claim to the term, that's not just bad for us, it's bad for those values, because we can't meaningfully champion them anywhere around the world. And as I speak to people around the world, it's not the first time I've spoken to people who have been sometimes upset with the U.S. or questioning what's going on in the U.S. But this is the first time I've ever been in touch with people in other countries, asking what's going on in our country, sounding like there's a note of pity or feeling sorry for us, the way you would speak about a troubled country. And our country with political violence, with the patterns of exclusion that we see, with the struggle in controlling the spread of a deadly disease, fits so many of the definitions of a troubled country, but also has things that I still believe in other countries don't have, because of our diversity, because of the tools, if we would only use them, the tools that are built into our system to make it better. And that's where I'm seeking to draw hope, even in such a morally as well as politically challenging time that we live in.
And lastly, and then I will defer to our moderator to do the question. I know you're coming in. I just want to put this out because I think Martin touched on it. I remember there was a time we could go to the Justice Department and say Breonna Taylor didn't get justice. We appealed to you. The local prosecutor did not do right and did not try and in our judgment, present the right case to the grand jury. But you can't even do that. We have an attorney general that not only operates as the personal lawyer for the president, he said in the case in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that Blake was committing a felony and had a weapon. And no one saw a weapon. We saw the video. They later said they claimed there was a knife in the car. I don't know if the policeman had x-ray vision and could see through the car door, because we certainly couldn't. How do you deal with going to a Justice Department where the Attorney General has already prejudged what could be a federal case? This is a time that we've got to rise up, because it is the first time in my lifetime we can't even talk about going to the federal government when states get out of whack. Even with the Voting Rights Act, Martin, where we wanted the Justice Department to have pre-clearance, this Justice Department having pre-clearance would not mean anything to protecting our voting rights.
Well, you know, you're absolutely on target, Rev. And what happened to upholding the law? An attorney general is appointed by the president, but is not supposed to work for the president. This attorney general only works for the president. And even his own department has finally begun to be critical of how he is running the department. And that again that's a stronger case for why we must vote someone else in office. The time is now. We don't have a moment to lose. As soon as polls open, they've already, I think in Virginia and some other places, voting is taking place.
Minnesota.
It's going to be around the 11th. You know, the first day, every day, we need to be making sure we're going to the polls and casting our votes. That will make the difference in terms of what happens on November 3rd.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Are we ready for some audience Q&A?
We can't hear you.
Oh, really?
We got you.
You got me? Okay. Can you not hear me, Rev? Oh. I'm not muted, so okay. Well, we'll start with a question from Silver. Rev, if you can hear me, just give me a thumbs up. Maybe not. Okay.
Right.
Oh. Well, maybe he'll come right back. So
I'll
we'll
try to play the question if he's not
Yeah.
able to hear it the first time.
Okay, so Silver is asking, we are so divided as never before. The three of you travel the country and have been afforded the opportunity to speak with folks on each side. What have you found to be the approach and argument that gets the attention of people who support the current administration, causing them to really stop, think, and consider joining us?
Well, one thing I'll mention, our campaign really prided itself on reaching out to everybody, and we never wavered from our values. I never watered down the reasons I was a Democrat, but part of how we carried Iowa was I really specialized in the counties that voted for President Obama and then voted for President Trump, knowing that we needed to call them back. And the most important thing that I found had to do with keeping it at the level of everyday life. And the impact on our everyday lives of the decisions that are being made, because the president wants us talking about whatever the tweet of the day is. When that happens, we're not talking about our own lives. And when we talk about these big battles that are described as if they're all about ideology, they still come down to how our lives are going to go. The Reverend mentioned the Supreme Court nomination, and I don't bear the nominee. I don't have anything against her personally. Matter of fact, she lives a few blocks away from my house where I'm sitting here in South Bend. But I can't help but think about members of my family whose lives depend on health insurance that they get thanks to the Affordable Care Act. That a nominee of this ideological bent may well strike down just a matter of weeks from now. Our lives will go differently depending on who's in charge. And then inviting people to see how others' everyday lives are shaped, whether it's by racial exclusion, whether it's by economic inequity. In the Reverend's chapter on LGBTQ experience, he talks about his sister and the personal connection that helps him to understand the importance of supporting one another. And I think as we try to be better at allyship, as we try to be better at outreach, connecting to people who are different from us, whether it's by background or by ideology, the best shot we have at that is to try to imagine everyday life for one another, and then try to talk about how that's actually shaped in the most intimate ways by the decisions made in those big buildings in Washington, D.C.
Rev, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, I couldn't hear you. I had to zoom in and back in to hear you.
Okay, but you can hear me now, so that's good.
I hear you now.
So Silver's question was, we are so divided as never before. The three of you travel the country and have been afforded the opportunity to speak with folks on each side. What have you found to be the approach and argument that gets the attention of people who support the current administration, causing them to really stop, think, and consider joining us?
I have found that if you talk to people about their own lives and not talk to them like you're standing on a mountaintop and they're in a valley, but about them, about their loved ones won't have pre-existing conditions if the Affordable Act is taken back. This is not about Obama. This is about your mama. This is about your life. When I talk about LGBTQ rights, I remember even in my own community, I write about in the book, my sister's gay, was gay all of my life. So she faced the social condition of being discriminated against because she was Black, because she was a woman, and because she was gay. And she would challenge me. I grew up a boy preacher. She challenged me at a young age. So now you're going to choose what bigotry you're going to fight when I'm facing all three, which made me have to deal with, I don't have the right to do that. You can't fight for anyone's rights if you don't fight for everyone's rights. I think that the way you deal with people on opposing sides is to make them look at their lives and then say, now, is the road you're traveling going to resolve and address the very lives that you deny? Not for Al Sharpton or Martin Luther King III. How will you and your family deal with if there's no affordable care? How would you and your family deal with if police are automatically right no matter what? How are you going to deal with the fact that you could have a relative that is discriminated against because of their sexual orientation? And when you make people deal with their own personal desires and then match it with the social order, sometimes they may not come all the way with us, but they begin to understand the commonality of our situations.
And let me just add one tiny thing, because hopefully it goes in line with what Rev has stated, as well as Mayor Pete. You know, we've seen this happen with COVID. A lot of, tragically, people have died of COVID. And you hear comments from some who said they felt let down by the president. They were Trump supporters. And so it's only when something personally impacts you sometimes that our eyes, the blinders, come off. We seem to be blind prior to, but it's very sad and tragic that it takes a crisis for us to see that things maybe are not right. And so I don't like to ever approach anyone in terms of what is negative, but you do have to approach people from a real perspective and at least raise questions, because maybe questions may help people to begin to change, because we've seen over time changes slightly. We haven't seen anywhere near enough. I mean, I'm saddened that I believe or have read that, you know, from a polling standpoint, that almost 40% of the people support this administration. That is very frightening in the United States of America, if that is true. And it makes no sense based on how I was raised. I mean, we can always look at, it's not about Democrat or Republican, but we can look at relationships, and we look back to when Republicans and Democrats reached across the aisle and worked together. And that wasn't so long ago. But today, there seems to be no ability to even cross the aisle and find things that you have in common that you want to do. I mean, how, in the name of God, do you not provide stimulus for Americans that are suffering, 30 million or more people who have been out of work and yet are still suffering because of the pandemic? And you just decide, well, we're not going to deal with that. And it obviously says you're living in a bubble. You're living in a different set of circumstances, because millions are hurting. And we used to pride ourselves on making sure that we help those who could not help themselves. None of us created this situation, but if we come together, we can hopefully resolve it.
So we have a lot of questions about gun violence. Maria's question is, in a perfect world, what should the federal government be doing to help local communities with gun violence and policing the police? And I want to go a little bit further and expand on to some of the other questions that people have and say, more than just the federal government, what should local government and state government also be doing?
Well, I would say that we must start with the banning of assault weapons and really regulate how we let gun manufacturers bring military-style weapons into the marketplace, and we do not prosecute or stop the profit in doing this. You know, what is not given a lot of attention is that a month after I did the eulogy at George Floyd's funeral, I did the eulogy for a 1-year-old kid killed by a stray bullet in Brooklyn, New York. there's no gun manufacturing plants in Brooklyn. And those kids that are shooting are getting those guns from manufacturers that are allowed to trade and allowed to go forward. There are no laws that are blocking them in many cities and states. I think that we have got to really have strong gun laws, and that is not inhibiting the Second Amendment. There's nowhere in the Second Amendment gives you the right to be able to shoot 30 times or 40 times and these kind of military style weapons. The fact that even after we saw that huge outpouring of the young people, where Yolanda Martin and Andrea's daughter was one of the main speakers, that we couldn't even get a background check passed by the Congress. A background check. The same people that want voter ID for you to vote don't want you to have a background check to buy a gun. There's something sick to me about that.
Rev, I might add just, and I know Mayor Pete has something as a policymaker to say, but you know, the House has passed several pieces of legislation. So while we're talking about Congress, we want people to focus on the United States Senate and Mr. McConnell, because that's where everything is held up.
That's right. Yeah, well said. I mean, the House has already acted on this, and it is maddening that something like background check, the vast majority of gun owners, the vast majority of Republicans, certainly the vast majority of Americans think we ought to do that, and it still doesn't happen. And what that shows you is the brokenness of the system. The fact that most Americans can want something as basic as background checks, and it still doesn't get through Mitch McConnell's Senate. And the only remedy to that is to, first of all, make sure that those who stand in the way experience a political penalty for it, but also to make sure that our system in time becomes more representative, which is why I do think structural reforms, just basic things, the fact that people who live in the District of Columbia don't have a senator. They're citizens. Their problems are just as important as the problems of those who live outside the District of Columbia. By the way, it would be the most African-American state in the union if it were a state. And the disfranchisement of people who live in D.C. is just one example of these things that just distort our structure, because most Americans are already there on issue after issue that we care about. And gun violence is a great example. The majority of the American people is not mirrored by a majority in the American Congress. That's a problem.
And let me say this. I know we're running out of time, but like Mayor Pete, you fought wars. We fought to bring democracy to the capital of Iraq, and we don't have it in the capital of the United States. I mean, how do we even justify that? People in the capital of the U.S. cannot have elected representation in their national government, but their kids can go to war to fight for capitals around the world. That is political schizophrenia.
That's right.
So I think I have two questions that might be a little bit briefer, if you don't mind. If anyone needs to run away, let me know. But I do really think this question is kind of inspiring. Robbie asks, what is something you heard today that made you feel hopeful?
Does it have to be today?
Maybe this weekend?
Well, I'm going to do take some personal privilege because, I get inspired almost every day by my wife, by my daughter. I think we all have personal experiences. And our daughter constantly inspires us by things that she does, little things that she does. When she said at the march on August 28th that my generation is going to be the generation, I don't want us to have to wait until her generation comes of age for us to address these issues. But she's very serious about taking a role at 12 years old to make change in our society that moves our society forward. But then my wife gave me something just the other day, which is we have to work for change. We have to pray for change. We have to be the change. And if love has not yet won, then the battle is not yet over.
I love that. I love that.
Drop the mic.
What a great message. I hesitate to follow that, but I'll echo it because I can't believe I'm old enough to say this, my tender age, but young people stepping forward, people younger than I am running for office, people not yet old enough to vote, who are taking to the streets or standing up, making sure that things get better in this country. We see examples of that all the time. Every day I'm seeing people stepping forward, and that helps me see that trajectory, that moral arc of the universe Dr. King talked about, and have faith that it's coming, but knowing that it doesn't come on its own, and we've all got a job to do.
I think that Mayor Pete acknowledged earlier, today's my mother's birthday. She passed 7 years ago. Martin came to the funeral. And what gives me hope is I get up very early in the morning before dawn and work out. And of course, I thought about my mother this morning. And I thought about how much we're facing these difficulties and how much unfairness and hate and institutionalized bigotry we face. And then I thought about how she faced even more. My mother couldn't vote in her hometown, Dothan, Alabama. I was born in Brooklyn. She came north. She couldn't vote until she was in her 30s. And I thought about that generation gave us so much. And it gives me the hope if they could break the stranglehold of where they couldn't even use a public toilet in her hometown. They had to brace themselves till they got on the black side of town. They couldn't go to a restaurant. They weren't allowed to go to school with whites. Yet in the span of her lifetime, she raised me to where I could run for president of the United States in 2004. So it gave me not only hope, it gave me a sense of guilt. How dare I not keep fighting? Because look at what her generation did for us.
Well, speaking of generations, that is my final question from the audience. Alex says, my 7-year-old Chelsea, who is going to be a future voter, who is watching this, which is fantastic. So I think that hopefully getting a lot of inspiration from your words, asks, was it scary doing this interview?
It was. I think that you don't know what's going to be asked, and certainly with the tremendous personalities that we were able to get Martin and Mayor Pete is always something that you have to prepare for. Mayor Pete is one of the brightest and most eloquent people on the national scene now, and Martin and his stature and his orations is in a class by itself. The only thing that that intimidates me more than being on a stage with Martin is to be on with his daughter. She upstages us every time.
She does.
Yeah, what I'd say to Alex is that anytime you know you're going to be in the company of extraordinary leaders, you want to make sure it's a conversation that goes well. And I certainly feel that way this evening. So I'm thankful that it was a very good conversation. But what's really scary is the thought of what would happen if we weren't doing the things we're committing ourselves to doing right now.
Yeah.
And so let's make sure those scary outcomes don't happen.
And finally, absolutely, Mayor Pete, you have to find the way to not embrace fear. In fact, fear is what has created a lot of the divisions that exist. My dad used to say, perfect love cast out fear. And I'm sure that there were times that he was not afraid, but concerned about the outcome of a particular situation. But he always continued to do what he thought was right. And I think that's what we all have to try to do. He used to say, the ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in times of comfort and convenience, but where you stand in times of challenge and controversy. And so this is the most challenging time for our nation, but it can become a defining moment when we all go to the polls and cast our votes to move forward and not move backward. It will be very defining. And as I say, Rev's book gives us almost a blueprint of what, if we take to heed what the book is saying, we will create a better, a more just, more humane nation that moves forward so that one day we will ultimately realize the dream that Martin Luther King Jr. Talked about on August 28, 1963.
Well, I want to thank all three of you, all of you legends, two of whom I have not had the pleasure of meeting before. Mayor Pete, we appreciate you doing this event for the second time with us, which is fantastic. And a reminder that the book is available for sale at left-bank.com. We have signed copies, and you can get one for everyone on your holiday shopping list. So, and now I'd like to welcome Chris back for Left Bank Books.
I just want to echo what you've said, Shane, and thank you, all three of you, for making time to speak to our community tonight. I think judging from the comments, I know it was really powerful for folks and inspiring. And thank you for your work. And be safe, be healthy. Thanks to everyone out there as well. And take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor.